Welcome to Auditing with Autism. Thanks for showing up here. I want to talk a little bit today about a big problem that we have here in the United States. The problem is that we have 350 million people in this country, and we only have 535 representatives representing those 350 million people. And this is a major problem because remember, when we started this country, we fought to have representation if we were going to have taxation. Well, currently we are seeing our taxation skyrocket, go through the roof. It's almost unaffordable to live now, these days. It's very difficult with mortgages, rent. It's hard to find a place to live. The price of food, gas, everything's going up. And we're getting taxed constantly for these things, and yet we still only have 535 representatives. Well, I have a solution for that problem that I wanted to talk to you about today. And I'm going to be leaving my wheelhouse of thinking about big ideas and philosophy and theology because I wanted to get a little bit specific about the solution and the problem here. And so I'm going to be talking a little bit about history here and getting into some specific facts. But history, I'm not a historian. I'm not a professional historian. And so I want to tip my hat off to all professional historians, and specifically Dr. Richardson, who I've been enjoying watching very much and learning a lot from. Professionals are professionals because they spend their time and energy caring about learning, and they share what they learn for the rest of us to benefit from, and I really thank you for that. And I also wanted to give a shout out to the honorable, inimitable Mr. Laporta. He feels like a doctor because of his knowledge. I found something on one of his posts that I'm going to quote here, and so I'm going to tip the hat to him, especially for Mr. Laporta. He's spent a lot of time thinking about the problem, and the problem as he sees it is that we are being controlled by the overlay of the corporate personhood that took control of our government in 1871. And I'm going to get into that a little bit. But first I want to describe that the problem that we have is lack of representation. We, for example, we have 350 million, like I said, in this country, which means that we have one representative for every 650,000 people. Okay, you could say, well, not every 350 million of us are voting age. Well, I looked into that, and it looks like there's about 260 million of us that are of voting age. And if you look at the fact that about 68% of us voted last time, so not all of the 268 million, but 68% of that voted. And then you divide that by 535 people in Congress, and you still get 330,000 people for one representative. Well, cities like Seattle, Denver, Baltimore, Memphis, these cities all have 600,000 people. And so, whether you want to look at it like one representative for 600,000 people or one representative for 330,000 people, either way, how would you feel if you lived in a city of 300 to 600,000 people and you elected just simply one person to make all the decisions for that entire city? I think most people would say that was unreasonable and wouldn't vote for something like that. Basically you would have a king controlling 300 to 600,000 people. They would make the decisions for those people. And of course the people can, give their opinion to that one person, but how would you regulate hundreds of thousands of opinions when you only have, through one person's ear? It just is untenable, and it's not realistic anymore to consider that as a working system. So Congress has a problem in representing us properly. And this has caused all the problems that we see today, including the current leadership, including the inflation and the problem that we have with rent and everything else that goes along with that. And so, one could say, well, the solution here has to be to increase the number of representatives. Well, if you did something like that, you would have to increase it to thousands. How many people would you want to represent us? Would you go to a city of 10,000 people and have one person controlling, making all the decisions for 10,000 people? Much less 300 or 600,000. Just 10,000 people. I mean, most people would say having one person making a decision for 100 people is unreasonable. The idea behind democracy is that everybody has an opinion and everybody gets to vote on that opinion. And so when we set up a representative government, we lost that a little bit. We pushed it down. We've made it so that the representatives would regulate and go through, govern all the thoughts and go through the opinions, and then our representatives were then supposed to take the majority of those opinions, or what they felt was the best interest for the people, and then vote on our behalf. But what I've identified as the problem here is not just the lack of representatives that we have, the lack of number, but we have another problem, which is that representatives are being bought off by corporations. And so this is when I started looking into the history of corporations in the United States. And it's really interesting because what happens is corporations, which are of course backed by big international banking cartel. By the way, the international banking cartel is a cartel that is hundreds and hundreds of years old, if not thousands of years old. I think it goes back to Rome and even beyond, even before that. So what the banking cartel has historically done is they hoard the gold and the silver. And this hoard of gold and silver has moved across time to go from, I'm getting this from Zarlanga's book, The Lost Science of Money. The hoard of gold and silver goes from Rome to Constantinople, when Rome moves to Constantinople about 1,500 years ago. And then it goes from Constantinople to Antwerp, where corporations, businesses were meeting and doing a lot of business. And again, bankers and corporations, they go hand in hand because corporations need to borrow money from bankers, or bankers need to lend money to business. And so they want corporations to be in existence. Either way you look at it, they sort of support each other and are the same thing. Anyway, the hoard goes from Antwerp to London, and then we see some crazy business practices happen, like what are they called when the poppy? No, it wasn't poppies. It was another flower. I forget. Somebody was just talking about it. They would have these boom and bust cycles. They would boom bust the sugar industry, the orchid industry. That's what it was, and they would manipulate the markets. The people that were in charge of this money hoard, I'm saying they're called the international banking cartel. They would manipulate the markets so that they could get more of the resources. Well, they went from London to, that hoard of money went from London to New York. And so when people say, as New York goes, the rest of the country goes, the reason they say that is because New York historically has had that hoard of money. And it certainly, was involved in getting us through the Revolutionary War. But, the point I wanted to make here is that the people lost the ability to be represented by our Congress when Congress got bought out by corporations or the bankers of the banking cartel. And so when you see lobbyists or special interest money showing up to give our politicians money, for they give them money so that the politicians will listen to what they have to say concerning their industry or their business or corporation. And so a lot of these politicians will be obviously influenced by receiving this money. It's a pretty common, I think, idea that people will be influenced if you give them things and if you spend time with them. And so our politicians are spending time with special interest money and lobbyist money, and not with the constituency, not with the people. Well, this is where we sort of lost our representation. And so I have an answer. I have a solution for our lost representation. The solution is to use the voter initiative process. The voter initiative process allows the constituency to create their own idea for a law, and then if they take that idea out to the public and get enough signatures, other constituents, to sign their name to the idea saying, hey, that's a good idea, I'll sign up for that idea. The idea of a voter initiative process is to get enough signatures to put the idea on the November ballot. And so this is how constituents can totally bypass their local state Congress by coming up with an idea themselves and putting it on the November ballot. And they can actually change their state constitution if they not only get enough signatures and then put it on the ballot, and then it passes. And so we have 26 states right now that have this voter initiative process. Why it's not in all 50 states, I have no idea, except for the fact that the banking cartel and the corporate world they don't want us to have this. They don't want us to have the voter initiative process because, for example, just to quickly point out, there's 26 states that have the voter initiative process. Well, I looked online and I found out that 18 of those 26 states created their voter initiative process all around the same time, within about 10 years, between 1900 and 1913. Actually, most of those 18 did it within a few years right before 1913. And this is important because of the 1913 Federal Reserve Act that was created. You see, when the banking cartel noticed that there was a populist movement happening because of Jennings, the politician named Jennings who ran as a third party candidate, and even the Bull Moose Party. Well, my point is that the voter initiative process was a populist movement that was started and created for the constituency, and it was it does give enough power in to the constituency to overtake and overcome the forces of the banking cartel and the corporate overlay that is currently cloaking our republic government. And I have a little bit of a history that I want to talk to you about how that cloaking happened, how they took over our government. But really quickly, I just want to suggest that if we created, using the voter initiative process, a law that allows people to vote on all pending bills concurrently with our elected legislators, then we would have more political capital. Political capital means prestige and clout. It doesn't literally mean money, but these days I will make a joke and say political capital means literally money. What it used to mean, influence. And at the core of any democracy, the influence is the constituency. And the voter initiative process gives that political capital back to the constituency. And so if we use the voter initiative process to pass a law that says now the voters can vote, they can vote on pending legislation concurrently, along with, in real time, with our elected legislators on any pending bill. Let's say there's a Senate bill number 13 on the floor, and Senate is, divided. They have 50 votes for, they have 50 votes against. Well, previously, it would be the vice president who would make the right now it's truth that it would be the vice president would break that tie. Well, I'm suggesting that we share that vote with those senators and with the House, but in this case, I'm using the senators because that's 100 members and it's easier to talk about. But if it was a split vote in the Senate, what if we, the people, took 1/5 of the voting pie? So if you have 100 senators and they vote, that's the whole pie. Well, let's just take 1/5 value. Let's add or take 100. Well, I was thinking of 100, 535. Let's just add 1/5. Take 1/5 of the voting pie, so that we would walk into Congress and split that vote. Or we would be able to influence the vote in such a way as there won't be a tie anymore. And I'm saying that I should probably just read this. I wrote this. This is a lot easier for me to explain it. It's this first. It starts in a syllogism. Hey, it's a fact. It takes money to become and act as a politician, right? It's a fact that politicians take money from special interests, right? It's also a fact that friends of politicians are special interests. Some people have tried to argue with me on that, but the proof is in the pudding here. And it's pretty clear that special interests are the friends of politicians. Therefore, politicians work for their friends. That means politicians are working for the special interests and the lobbyists, their friends, the people that give them money, and they don't work for us. And so not only are we not represented by enough, congressmen and women and senators, but we're also not, we don't have enough political capital anymore. Those politicians are in Congress being influenced by big money. So this is the problem. And if we allowed our voters to have a slice of the voting pie along with our elected legislators, this would be really important, because if we represented 20% of the value vote, for example, Congress would be forced to work harder towards bipartisanship and towards compromise. And this is true because if they did not gain enough alliances and support to pass their bills, which would encourage them to gain alliances and support with each other across the aisle. But if they didn't do that, we, the people, we would swing the vote easily. It would be just as if all the voters walked into Congress wielding a 20% value vote on any bill pending. And imagine, this is what consensus can do for us. And originally, I came up with this idea after I graduated from seminary. And I thought to myself, I'm sitting at the table. This is like a year after I graduated. And I'm thinking to myself, what is the best thing for me to do with my life from this moment on? After everything I learned in college, what could I do using that knowledge that would help the most people? And it always came back to education. It comes back to education because the more you know, the less you need. When you know more things, it's harder to be taken advantage of. It's when you know more of how things work and how yourself works and how, society works, it will be harder for people to fool you. And being a critical thinker is the answer. I thought to myself, that was the solution. And so, at first I got a substitute teaching license that was good for 4 years. And that was a lot of fun. I really enjoyed teaching, K through 12. It was such a great time. But in the end, I'm feeling like I'm not getting enough well, first you're sort of, slightly restricted in what you can teach, which isn't that restricting really, but it seems like, you know, uh, education on a mass scale without any doctrine behind it is the key, is the answer. So I thought to myself, well, how can you educate the most people, especially if people don't really want to be educated? I certainly remember how it used to feel like, there were times when I loved school, but if I didn't like school for whatever reason was going on, then I really didn't like it. And I thought to myself, I'm never going to use this information, in real life. And I thought, well, what am I even doing here? This is a waste of time. But if you are interested in learning and you're focused on it, it can change your life. And so I wanted to get an idea that would get people back into wanting to learn. And so I thought to myself as I sat there at the coffee table, this was like 2 or 3 days. I got this brain idea happening in a couple 3 days that was fantastic. But at any rate, I sat there and I thought, well, what's interesting is when people buy something, they learn everything about it. If you buy a computer, you want to learn all about it. You buy a car, you want to learn all about it. Anytime somebody owns something, they want to learn all about it. So I thought, that's the answer. If we could own the vote, then we would learn all about the vote. And that would be it. That would be the impetus to getting people to wanting to learn. And what are they learning about? They're learning about the very bill up for vote, the most important thing that could affect their lives at any given moment. And so it would get rid of apathy from the voter, and it would give the voter more political capital if we could participate in owning the vote along with or concurrently with our elected legislators. And ultimately, I think if we really took this idea on, eventually I can see that we may not need Congress, anymore. I've thought a lot about that. I mean, Congress is really important. These are people that are, usually very dedicated in learning about these bills and do care about their constituents. I don't want to broad brush the idea that all politicians are bad, but more that the industry of politics is bad, And so if we, the people, took over Congress, then we would have the ability to, really select who we might want to look into possible laws that we would come up with ourselves and vote on for ourselves. Remember when American Idol was on, or maybe it's still on? But American Idol, we would see these people on TV singing, and then we would use our phone in real time to vote for them. And then at the end of the show, we would see the tally of that vote. And I thought to myself, why couldn't we do that with pending legislation? I mean, sure, we would need more secure voting systems in place than what American Idol uses, but we could certainly collaborate with each other to create that security and have an public oversee that could make sure it was secure, and then do that. We could vote on our very own phones throughout the day as we live our lives on pending legislation concurrently with these politicians. If we had that, those politicians could not just go take money from special interests and lobbyists without having some second thought or reflection. They would have to look over their shoulder constantly to see if we were looking at what they're doing, because we would own part of the vote, right? So we would care a lot about whatever we're voting on. Say Senate Bill 13 again, right? Some fictitious bill. If Senate Bill 13 was about to pass or not pass, was up for vote, anybody who's participating in this new idea would want to learn about it. They would really want to learn about it. They would create discussion boards. They would talk about it with each other, and it would really matter because they would in real time be voting on that bill. And in real time, they would see how the bill went, if it passed or didn't pass. They would also see whether their own state or local politician, senator or representative, they could see whether or not their senators were voting against what their state's constituents were wanting. If 8 out of 10 voters said, I want Senate Bill 13 to pass, and then their state senators votes against Senate Bill 13, 8 out of 10 people are going to wonder what the hell happened there, and they're going to continue to learn and contact that senator and talk to that person and find out what's going on. So all of this will give us, as voters, more political capital. And this is how we fight back against the international banking cartel, which is establishing and has established corporations that are now influencing our politicians. It took, this didn't happen overnight. It took a couple hundred years. But in the first 100 years after the establishment of our country, they went to work. They went to work right away to dismantle our republic. They didn't like it that we created a country where if we wanted to, we could just start printing our own money. And it wasn't connected to the international banking money at all. They did not like that. They want to have control of our money. That's actually their goal. The goal of the goal of the international banking cartel, according to the Lost Science of Money book by Stephen Zarlanga, is to control the money supply and of every country. And that's what they did. That's exactly what happened. But the last time that our country manufactured its own money supply, our own paper money, was during the Civil War in the 1860s. I think 1862, 1863, we saw, the creation of the greenback. And the greenback, it was the last time that we saw our country print our own money for ourselves. And the way we do it now is we call up the international banking cartel. We call them the Federal Reserve. We call them up and we say, hey, we would like $1 billion. The banking cartel says, okay. And then that gives us permission to turn on our very own printing presses and print $1 billion for ourselves. But every note says that it's not our dollar. It's actually the Federal Reserve's dollar. And that means we're going to pay interest to the Federal Reserve. All taxpayers are paying interest to the Federal Reserve whenever we borrow money from them. We borrow money from them even though we print the money in our own Treasury Department. It just makes no sense. Like in the Civil War, why don't we just print the money like we did with the greenback and not pay interest to the international banking cartel? Well, that's not what the international banking cartel wants. They want to control our money supply, and therefore they will control our government. And so I'm going to give you a couple dates here. I'm going to give you a date of 1819. I'm going to give you a date of 1838. I'm going to give you another date of 1871 and 1913. And I'm finally going to end at 2010. In the year 1819, there was a case in the Supreme Court called Dartmouth College versus Woodward. I think Woodward was the Secretary of State or in charge of the U.S. Treasury. And Dartmouth College had, anyway, received a contract from the King George III in 1769 to become a college. Well, after the Revolutionary War, Secretary of State, I'm going to say, Woodward, wanted to take Dartmouth College and turn it into a public entity so that it was, socialized, publicized. It was to become a state college, essentially. Well, the people that worked at Dartmouth College said, hey, wait a minute, we have this contract with King George, the loser of the Revolutionary War, but we want you to honor the contract. And so it went to court, And one could say the U.S. government lost. Woodward lost, and Dartmouth College won, and it upheld private contracts as similar to individual rights, and that the states could not interfere with business that way. States could not negate a private contract willy-nilly. And so this was the beginning of corporate personhood and the erosion of individual personhood. In 1819, Dartmouth College versus Woodward was the beginning of the corporate overlay of our Republican government. And the corporate overlay, again, is, when I say corporate, I'm also saying the international banking cartel. Okay, 1819, they got their foot in the door of individual rights. I mean, a corporation now was called, had some rights as an individual person. Now, this quote I got from the inimitable, honorable Mr. Laporta, and this one is from 1838, and this quote was, or is, important because it was the last time, essentially, that the court said that we, the people, are in charge here. It's really important. It was the 1838 court case called Spooner versus McConnell. And it said, quote, "The sovereignty of a state does not reside in the persons who fill the different departments of its government, but in the people from whom the government emanated. And they, the people, may change it at their discretion. Sovereignty, then, in this country abides with the constituency and not the agent. And this remark is true both in reference to the federal and state governments." So in 1838, the constituency, or we, the people, and not the agent or the government, is in charge here. And that was an incredibly important ruling that was in the face of this corporate overlay. We started the Republican government in 1776, and then the corporate overlay starts to happen, and it grows and grows. It starts off small and then gets bigger, and now they're cloaking our entire government in this corporate government overlay. That was 1838. The court said, yeah, the constituents have all the power to change the government how they want to, and the agent does not have power. So when we had the Civil War, I read this book. A lot changed during the Civil War. I read this book called, I wrote it down because I always forget the name of it. It's called Nothing Like It in the World by Stephen Ambrose, a great historian. Nothing Like It in the World was the history about the the Continental Railroad. It was how President Lincoln became embedded with the corporate world, basically using their money, because we had just fought this Civil War and had no more money in the coffers. So he basically was doing business with private business, and i.e. the international bankers, to establish the idea of and to start the beginning of creating the railroads across the country. And so there were the people in the East, they started their railroad from the East going west. And then there were the people in the West that started their railroad from California, and they were going to go east. And the people in the West had to go through the Sierra Nevada mountains and make lots of tunnels, and it was really slow going. But on the side of the East, they had grasslands, and it was all flat, so they were chugging along many miles a day. And anyway, what that meant was that big business was in cahoots with big government. That's when we saw, after the Civil War, immediately after the Civil War, with the creation of the Continental Railroad, big business getting in bed with big government. So that's, in the 1867, 1868. A side note, conspiracy theory here. One could say that maybe a big banker tried to figure out how to get somebody to kill Lincoln, like fan the flames of anger for losing the war. And it just benefited big business so much when Lincoln was shot that it's, who knows, but it really seems likely to me that after, if you know anything about Sirhan or Lee Harvey Oswald and these types of people, that there could be these types of people in the 1860s that were being taken advantage of to mess with their minds so that they would want to kill, and that could benefit, some larger group here. Well, it certainly did. Lincoln dies and is not in control anymore, and when Grant becomes president, he's an alcoholic and he has trouble keeping it together. I'm sorry, Davis. Who was it? Wasn't it Davis? Yeah, Vice President Davis, and then Grant. I mean, both the vice president who became president after Lincoln, and then President Grant. They were not able to stand up to these big businesses. Again, I want to apologize. I'm not a professional historian. Definitely get. If you have any interest in any of these names or dates, go take a look yourself. But what I'm trying to say here is that in 1871, shortly after the Civil War and after this big business relationship to get the Continental Railroad going, there was something that passed in Congress called the Dictionary Act. And the Dictionary Act, it sounds so benign, right? It sounds harmless, but the Dictionary Act of 1871 redefined the term person to include corporations, firms, partnerships, societies, and stock companies. And so what we see there is the complete overlay. It completely happened. It hasn't even been 100 years, 1776 to 1870. It's not even 100 years yet that we've had this country where we saw the corporate world redefine the actual term person, so that if you call yourself a person, that means you are literally a business agent. You're not a natural human. That's something else. You're now a corporate citizen. And that means another tip of the hat to Honorable Mr. Laporta here for these terms, but now you have the difference between something called a sovereign national versus a corporate citizen. A sovereign national is what we used to be, after we had the Revolutionary War and we created our country. We were all national sovereign nationals, free citizens, and under the law of nature. And when you live under the law of nature, you have certain rights, unalienable rights to defend yourself, life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, these kinds of things. Well, in 1871, they redefined, using the Dictionary Act, they redefined the term person to make it so that if you're a person, now you're a corporate citizen. So you have that's what it was. Mr. Laporta, he gave me these terms. You are a privileged class or a protected class. The privileged class sounds better, but it's not. The privileged class is the corporate citizen I'm referring to. The privileged class, they will receive privileges that the corporate state will give you. And whenever you get privileges, you're giving up your rights to receive those privileges. And so the other term was, protected class. When you're a protected class, that means you are still a sovereign nationalist who has all the human rights of a free citizen. I know it gets a little complicated, and it's not easy to untangle this whole thing because they don't want it to be easy. They want you to be confused and confounded. But let me just read really quick. This was in 1876, just 5 years after the Dictionary Act turned the definition of person to corporations, to mean a corporation. This says here, basically it's going to say that a citizen has two sovereignties. They say in this quote here that the two sovereignties are the federal government and the state government. And the state government at that time, 1876, still had, it was easier to be a sovereign national. Well, from 1876, when this quote I'm about to read, to now, we've seen the states also become overlaid with this corporate reality. It didn't just end in Washington, D.C. So after 1871, they turned the idea of a person into a corporation as well. It says in 1876, quote, this is the Supreme Court of the United States. They say it is the natural consequence of a citizenship which owes allegiance to two sovereignties and claims protection from both, that the citizen cannot complain because he has voluntarily submitted himself to such a form of government. And then right below that, I'm reading this on Wikipedia. Wikipedia says, quote, your birth did not voluntarily submit yourself to government. Just because you're born doesn't mean you've submitted. No, it says, quote, to do that, you have to give an oath or an allegiance. So, what they don't tell you when we're growing up and going to school is that if you don't give an oath of allegiance to the corporate government that has overlaid on top of our original republic government, they don't teach you in school that if you do not give an oath to that corporate government, which is usually I pledge allegiance to the flag, that kind of an allegiance, then you're a natural citizen. You have natural rights under natural law. And so the corporate world, and i.e. the international banking cartel through the corporate world, want to take away your natural rights. That's the big story here and why I'm involved with this topic. The big idea is our natural rights under nature, and I'm going to, I study theology, so I'm going to say it's under God. There's three types of laws. There's, the law of God, the law of nature, and the law of man. And so corporations and bankers want to use the law of man to control you and take you away from your rights that you have under the law of nature. And all of this is under the law of God. So they don't want you to have any connection or ideas concerning that, for sure, And so that gets me into other topics of physics and mathematics and stuff and theology. We're seeing the proof now of the law of God, the framework, which is the law. All the law of God means to me is that there is some framework, some framer who has created a framework for the universe to exist in. And in that existence of the universe, we call that the law of nature. And in the law of nature, or in the universe, we see people, and they create the law of man. So the law of God is kind of important here, because that's what a lot of these controllers, like the banking cartel, they want to be the law of nature or the law of God even over us. They don't even want us to think about it, or have any knowledge about it, in my opinion. Okay, so in 1871, they changed the definitions. They turned people into the idea of person into also corporations. And so that means corporations, at first they had some of the rights as people. And in 1871, now all the people have the rights of a corporation. And they want us to feel like we're obligated to have a participation with that corporate style of government. I mean, even I say here, even Washington D.C., in 1871, it was reorganized into a federal corporation. So, the federal corporation was completed in 1871, and then from then to now, states' rights have also been overlaid with this corporate fake reality. I call it. It's a way for bankers and big business to control the constituency. Well, they finished with their control agenda in 1913 with the creation of the Federal Reserve Act. The Federal Reserve Act was, an act, a law that allowed the corporate and the banking cartel of the international world to actually be in control of our money. It allowed a group of private bankers to be in charge of issuing the money. Like I said before, if we want to borrow money as a nation, we borrow it from the Federal Reserve. And we don't have to do that because all we have to do is print the money ourselves. That's what the Federal Reserve is doing. It's not backed by gold anymore or anything. It's just paper money that they can issue and create inflation at will. And so this is, a big problem for us. Why don't we just do that ourselves and not have to pay any of the interest? We might even be more responsible with that money because we would be thinking about ourselves, our local communities, and not the wants and desires of the big banking cartels. Wow, this time's getting on. I guess I'm having fun. So I'm almost done too, just a couple minutes away here. The last date I have for us, well, I just wanted to point out really quickly, how I said in 1913, the Federal Reserve Act was created and it allowed the big bankers to take over our creation of our money supply. Well, 2 years later, we saw the first DMVs really start, happening. The Vehicle Act of 1915 established federally the idea of the DMV system, which, that was the beginning of registering all of our vehicles and, paying a lot of money for licensing. And, we started seeing these policies and codes, and then we wanted to hire police to, make sure we were following those policies and codes. And these policies and codes are for the benefit of these corporations and bankers, not always for the benefit of the citizens. And so when we see trouble, like I see nowadays, I see a lot of police on YouTube that are taking advantage of their position as police and hurting the citizens. And it was all because the citizen didn't have a license, or they didn't have a tag, or, they were a couple miles over the speed limit. And the next thing I'm watching, the police officer is beating them up or arresting them and throwing them in jail and towing their car. And this is all against what the Supreme Court has said as far as concerning our ability to transfer our goods on the highway and stuff like that. So it was just a couple of years after the creation of the Federal Reserve that they started instituting all these licenses and registrations and policies and statutes and codes that were designed for ultimately to control us. And it also took a lot of money out of our pocketbooks, which is another way to control us. And so finally, 2010, the Citizens United versus the Federal Election Commission. When Citizens United won that, and it allowed for unlimited donations of unlimited money to politicians from corporations. That meant that corporations could pay hundreds of millions of dollars, like we saw Elon Musk give to Donald Trump to win his presidency. And this is not fair. This is not fair. This goes right in the face of having representatives if we're going to be taxed, it's not fair to see a small group of people, give a huge amount of money uh, to politicians when most of the voters are not able to do that. And it's also something we never allowed for before. But it's a good one to point out because in 2010, when the Citizens United got it so that they could give as much money as they wanted to their political candidates, it made it so that the full effect of totalitarianism, the full effect of corruption was in place. It basically it took away our political capital and gave it all to anybody who had money, and that's not fair. And that's why we have trouble. And so my solution is to create a new system in Congress that allows all the constituents the ability to vote concurrently with their elected officials on any pending legislation. And the way to do that is to use the voter initiative process that we have in these 26 states right here. And, take a look at those states and see if one of them is yours. If it is, then you can do this. You can come up with the idea that says we want to vote along with our elected legislators and go out to the large cities or wherever you want and start getting signatures. And if you do get signatures and you get enough signatures, then you can put that on the election, on the November ballot and vote for it. And I think that's really important because we're going to have to try to fight back somehow. Another great way is civil disobedience. Like we saw the No Kings rally and other things like that. Gandhi showed us the way to do civil disobedience. Look at Gandhi's life and see what happened with how he did it. He showed us that you can defeat the British Empire by sitting down and saying, no, I'm not going to do this. But it takes courage to do that. Courage that I'm looking for even now. And I see other people doing it, like Mr. Laporta and others. Proper instruction motivates people, or power inherent in the people. I mean, these are YouTube channels where these guys are courageous and they're talking about these ideas and how to deal with them. And so I'm going to leave it at that. I think that's enough minutes. And I just lastly want to say, if there's anything I can do to encourage us to get out there, I certainly would do it here. And I don't know what it is to say or do, but I just wanted to let you know that we're all in this together. I'm thinking a lot about it. I have a lot of passion, the good passion for these kinds of ideas and thoughts. And I think a lot of us do, because nobody likes to be taken advantage of and be a dupe or a rube. And together, when we put our thinking hats on and we put our brains together, there's more of us than there is of them. Yeah, they've spent a lot of their money to create a system where it's hard to fight back. But ultimately, we are innumerable. And I mean, so, history has proven that we can always win if we come together. And to come together, we have to feel, to come together, we need education. And to get education, I've discovered we have to own something. We have to feel like we own something. And so they've been systematically taking our ownership of politics away from us, if you paid attention a little bit. And I found a way to get that ownership of politics back to the people. It's always been in Congress. It's in Congress that we the people reside. And, the executive branch is for the leader of the military. The judicial branch is for, the people in charge of the courts, the judicial process. And that's important. But when it comes to Congress, that's the branch for us, for we the people. And so that's where we need to make our stand. And it's through our politicians. And if they don't want to help, then we need to have a process using the voter initiative process to take over Congress, because that's where the laws are being made. And I'm telling you, if 9 out of 10 people want to see some change and those politicians in Congress are not making that change happen for us, then they're not representing us. And how could they? There's one of them for every 600,000 of us. That's never fair. So, okay, I'm done with my little soapbox rant. Next video, I'll probably go back to some big idea about theology or philosophy. But thanks for hanging out. It's been a good long, almost an hour. Thanks for hanging out, you guys. I love you guys. Talk to you later. Bye-bye.